Welcome to Lesson 1.9, all about federalism. In today's lesson, you need to know what federalism is, how it relates to the 10th Amendment, a little bit about how states relate to each other, the guarantees that the Constitution provides to the states, and why the national Constitution is supreme to the states. You should also be able to describe examples of the powers that the states, the national government, both have, and what they share, which is sometimes called concurrent powers. Here's your overview for today's lecture. Make sure that you've taken good notes in some structured format. Now, the first topic in today's lesson is what federalism is, and that's really a concept of how government is structured. It's the idea that certain powers are shared between the national and the state government, and some are reserved or only for the national government, and certain powers are only for the states. According to the 10th Amendment, only the powers that are listed in the Constitution are given to the national government, and everything else belongs to the states. So it sorts out that resolution of how do we decide whose power it is to do what. The old way of describing federalism was sometimes called layer cake federalism, so there's a picture for you. Under layer cake federalism, there were very clear distinctions between what was a national power and what was a state power. It kind of made it really easy to tell. But since the 1940s, the national government and state power have kind of mixed in together a little bit, particularly in things like education and transportation. The idea that the government would provide money to build highways, or the government would provide money to provide for the schools, for certain aspects of schools, or even regulating how schools should operate, how commerce should be regulated, that we would have something like a minimum wage law for the entire country. Those ideas only date to the 1940s, and so we sometimes call this idea of marble cake federalism, where the powers are kind of mixed up in between each other a little bit. Now, although we have marble cake federalism today, we can still kind of generalize in terms of what are national powers versus state powers and what are shared. So here's a Venn diagram for you. It's important to pause the video at this point and take notes on these specific things. But I'm going to explain in just a second a few of them. Okay, so the first thing that you need to take a little bit of care with is collecting taxes. Both of them can collect taxes, but the national government is only allowed to collect certain taxes, whereas states can collect all kinds. So for example, the national government does not have the power to collect a sales tax, but states are allowed to do that. The national government is allowed to collect an income tax, but that was only after an amendment to the Constitution. So taxes is a biggie where there used to be a lot less tax power for the national government. Another example is regulating commerce. You can see there that the national government is allowed to regulate interstate commerce, and the states are allowed to regulate state commerce. But really there's a blend there in many ways. It used to be much more distinct that you had to really show, if you were the national government, you wanted to regulate commerce, that it was something that crossed state lines. In addition, what we've seen is that many of these state powers, like setting up schools, regulating commerce, making regulations about marriage, they've become restricted by the National Bill of Rights. Originally, when the Bill of Rights was written and many of the amendments were written, they didn't apply to the states. The states had their own bills of rights, for example. But what we've seen is that the Supreme Court has consistently ruled and extended the protections of the Bill of Rights to the states. So, for example, recently, this national Supreme Court overturned many state laws about marriage, saying that essentially same-sex marriage was a right under the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. So states can regulate marriage within certain bounds of the national government. Now to move on to interstate relations. That's just the idea of how do states relate to one another. States under the Constitution are required two things. Basically, they're required to grant all the privileges and immunities that they give to their own citizens to the citizens of other states. So they can't discriminate based on what state you're from, mostly, with the exception of a few things that maybe we pay for, like tuition to go to universities. But even then, they're fairly limited. States are also required to honor the contracts of other states with full faith and credit, which means they can't discriminate about which state you got divorced in, or custody of children, family law, property ownership, all that stuff. Basically, the contracts of one state apply in all the other states. A couple more constitutional issues. The Constitution guarantees to the states that the national government will ensure that they have a representative democracy, a republic. So the governor of Missouri, for example, can't set himself up as a dictator. The national government promised the people of Missouri that they would make sure that we continue to have a republic. The national government also has promised it will protect the security of the states from invasion and rebellion and whatnot. And the national government has also promised that each state will always have equal representation in the Senate. Senate. That's kind of a little clause in the Constitution that says we cannot change that to say that the senators would be based on population. We can't change it. It's in the Constitution that it's not allowed. The last part about federalism is going to be the idea of national supremacy. All that means is that the national laws, the Constitution, the treaties that our national government signs, they are supreme to state laws and constitutions. The Supreme Court has ruled against states trying to interfere with the federal law in a very important case called McCulloch versus Maryland. You have to know the name of the Supreme Court case. It basically said, hey, the national government's supreme, so don't try to cancel or nullify or otherwise disobey federal laws. That doesn't mean they don't try. There's several examples of that. And sometimes the federal government kind of just looks the other way and doesn't enforce federal laws. And other times they say, no, you have to abide by our laws. So it's kind of a little wishy-washy at times depending on what the federal law that's been broken is. But the Constitution and the Supreme Court have been very clear that if the national government wants to, it can say, we are supreme to your state laws. So don't try to cancel them. Anyways, hopefully you've taken good notes. These are your objectives. Make sure that you know them, and we'll see you next time.